Chapter 3. Apologetic and Polemics. Ideas do not exist in a social vacuum, as topics of polite and disinterested conversation among disembodied intellects. On the contrary, in intellectual or religious history, we are dealing with flesh and blood people who care deeply, often passionately, about defending their own convictions and criticizing or attacking those of others. These two basic activities, apologetic on behalf of one's own ideas and polemics against those with which one disagrees, mutually imply one another. By denouncing the doctrines of others as false, one simultaneously asserts one's own claims to orthodoxy and orthopraxy, and conversely, defending one's own position means questioning that of others. Point 1. Ideas, moreover, do not just exist in people's heads or in the pages of books. They become embodied in social institutions with a lifespan of many generations, churches, universities, political parties, etc., which have a deep investment in consolidating and maintaining their own identity by any means available to them. Whether by tradition and socialization or by deliberate choice or conversion, individuals may either commit themselves to what such institutions stand for, or criticize and reject them, perhaps giving their allegiance to alternative and competing ones. Whatever side one is on, a particularly effective strategy for establishing and cementing one's own identity is to simultaneously create the image of an other. In order to make clear what we are all about, they, whoever they are, must be depicted as our perfect antithesis. What is really at stake in such rhetorics is power. That is to say, the ability to dominate an existing discourse to such an extent that one can decide what will and will not be accepted as valid and true. Once a certain measure of such discursive power has been attained, it can easily be translated into real political power. The ability to put one's own agendas into action, and silence, suppress or discredit dissenting voices. Such measures can be highly effective over long periods of time, particularly because those who dominate the discourse have the power to educate new generations in conformity with their own beliefs, but they are never final and secure. Any dominant party may use the rhetorical weapon of othering to dismiss its opponents as despicable heretics, dangerous subversives or ridiculous fools, thereby implicitly confirming its own identity as orthodox, reliable or reasonable. But those at the receiving end of such polemics will try to use the same weapon against their opponents, for example by depicting them as arrogant and blind oppressors or mindless bureaucrats who rely on power because they lack the arguments to convince, thereby promoting their own identity as champions of freedom, tolerance, and reason. If they manage to muster enough support for their narrative, this may affect the balance of power and lead to larger or smaller intellectual, social, and even political revolutions. The category that we now refer to as Western Esotericism, but which, it must be repeated, has been known by a variety of other names as well, is the outcome of such discursive processes, involving polemical/apologetic debates that go back to the period of late antiquity. To a much larger extent than is usually realized, it stands for the sum total of rejected knowledge, against which both mainstream Christian culture and modern or secular society have established their own identity. Even today, it remains their principal other, whether or not we are consciously aware of it. This is a reason to be extremely cautious about trusting the dominant narratives that circulate about its ideas, its practices or its history. There is an enormous difference between how everything that pertains to the field of Western esotericism is depicted in common discourse or imagined in the polemical and apologetic imagination, and what we find if we study the historical sources. To give a small and obvious example, Cornelius Agrippa has been remembered through the centuries as a black magician and a model of the Faust figure who sells his soul to the devil. But if one studies his writings, one discovers an extremely pious Christian for whom unquestioning faith in Jesus Christ was the exclusive foundation of any reliable knowledge. To get a handle on such discrepancies between reality and imagination, it is useful to draw a distinction between history and Nemohistory. Point 2. In simple terms, the former refers to what has happened in the past, the latter to how we remember it. Accordingly, the attempt to describe what has actually happened may be referred to as historiography, whereas Nemohistoriography is the attempt to describe the genesis and development of what a given culture imagines has happened. If we stick to our example, a historian will want to know who Agrippa really was and what he really believed, whereas a Nemohistorian is interested in analyzing how Agrippa has been remembered by later generations. His focus is on tracing the chain of reinterpretations, distortions, misunderstanding and creative inventions that have come to be attached to Agrippa's name, and which, it should be emphasized, are mainly responsible for his continuing fame and notoriety. For there should be no mistake about it. In the real world, history is no match for Nemohistory. Nemohistorical narratives have an enormous power to influence real historical events, regardless of whether they have any basis in demonstrable fact. Even wild historical fantasies may have a greater impact than the carefully documented reconstructions of historians. Worrying though the fact may be, what appears to count most is not whether the stories are true, but whether they are believed. The focus in the rest of this chapter will be on the Nemohistory of Western esotericism. How has this field been constructed in the polemical and apologetic imagination of mainstream culture, and why? To find out, we will focus on the three central contexts in which this process of construction has taken place: pre-Reformation Christianity, Protestantism, and modernity. Early Christianity and the Church of Rome. Early Christianity had to establish its identity against both Judaism and the religions of others, referred to by various names such as Gentiles, heathens, nations, or, eventually, pagans. The Apostle Paul inherited from his Jewish upbringing an abhorrence of any worship directed away from the one invisible God towards images resembling mortal man or birds or animals or reptiles, Rom. 1.23, and idolatry became ingrained in Christianity as a sin par excellence. But whereas the cultic practices of pagan religion could be rejected clearly and unequivocally, as worship of demons, the philosophical systems of the Gentiles were a different matter. It is true that some early fathers of the Church found them incompatible by definition with both Jewish and Christian religion, as shown by a famous statement of Tertullian. What indeed has Athens to do with Jerusalem, the academy with the Church, heretics with Christians? 3. But many others were willing to engage in some kind of constructive dialogue, particularly with the Platonic traditions that were widespread among intellectuals in the Hellenistic culture of the Roman Empire. The consequences have been enormous, both for the later history of Christianity and for what we now refer to as Western esotericism. The Apologetic Fathers. In their attempts to convince Gentile intellectuals about the superiority of their new faith, apologists for Christianity were faced with a serious problem. It was a general conviction of the age that any religion worth its salt had to be rooted in ancient and venerable traditions. Everybody, including the Jews, agreed that nothing could be both new and true. 4. By claiming that their faith had originated very recently, with Jesus Christ, Christians were therefore inviting ridicule. For example, a 2nd-century pagan philosopher called Celsus was making fun of them as a people without roots, who wall themselves off and break away from the rest of mankind. I will ask them where they come from, or who is the author of their traditional laws. Nobody, they will say. 5. And a century later, the Neoplatonist Porphyry was equally puzzled by a community of believers who thought that they could just cut out for themselves a new kind of track in a pathless desert. 6. Christian apologists took such accusations seriously, and felt they needed to have an answer. They found it in what we have referred to as Platonic Orientalism. The widespread belief that Plato had taught not just philosophy but an ancient religious wisdom, rooted not in his own Greek culture but ultimately derived from the most ancient and venerable traditions of the Orient. Egyptians pointed to Hermes Trismegistus as the original fountain of such ancient theology, Persians to Zoroaster, Greeks to Orpheus or Pythagoras, but Christian apologists such as Justin Martyr, Tatian, Clement of Alexandria, Origen or Eusebius of Caesarea argued that all those Gentile philosophers had ultimately depended on the ancient wisdom of the Hebrews, codified by Moses at Mount Sinai, which had now attained its final and full splendor in the teachings of Jesus Christ. This argument implied that Christianity was not radically new. It was a revival, after a long period of decline due to the influence of demons, whom the pagan nations kept worshipping as their gods, of the true ancient religion rooted in Mosaic wisdom. That religion had been inspired by the eternal Logos, the divine word, from the very beginning, even long before it was finally made flesh, and dwelt among us in the person of Jesus Christ, JN 1.1-14. A particularly eloquent statement of this position comes from one no less than St. Augustine. The very thing which is now called the Christian religion was with the ancients, and it was with the human race from its beginning to the time when Christ appeared in the flesh. From when on the true religion, which already existed, began to be called the Christian. 7. The implication, for Christians, was that one could expect to find nuggets of true wisdom not only in the Jewish and Christian scriptures, but even in the writings of pagan sages. Venerable authorities such as the Egyptian Hermes Trismegistus or Plato himself could have drunk from the wells of the Mosaic revelation, or could have been directly inspired by the divine Logos even without knowing it. As such, they could be seen as unconscious Christians through whom God had been gently preparing humanity for the advent of the gospel. This notion opened up all the philosophical writings of antiquity as potential sources of study and inspiration for Christians. It could be powerfully supported with reference to Paul's mission to the Greeks. Referring to their altar devoted to the unknown God, the apostle had famously told the Athenians that whom you ignorantly worship, him I declare unto you, Acts 17.23. The importance of this apologetic tradition, for Western esotericism and for Christianity as a whole, can hardly be overstated. Rather than following in Tertullian's footsteps by rejecting any pagan philosophy as incompatible with Christianity, countless theologians came to adopt Platonic and other Greek philosophical frameworks and concepts in their efforts to make sense of the Christian message. A typical and extremely authoritative case is Augustine himself, who stated that no one has come closer to us, that is, the Christians, than the Platonists, and affirmed that true doctrines might also be held by wise men or philosophers of other nations, be they Atlantic Libyans, Egyptians, Indians, Persians, Chaldeans, Scythians, Gauls, or Spaniards. 8 A particularly impressive example, among many others, of how intimately Platonic philosophy could become integrated with Christian theology, is the anonymous 5th/6th century author known as Dionysius the Areopagite, because he was incorrectly identified as a Greek intellectual converted by St. Paul at the occasion of his Areopagus speech to the Athenians, mentioned above, Acts 17.34. The extremely influential writings of this pseudo-Dionysius were permeated by Neoplatonic metaphysics and lent further plausibility to the alliance between Platonic philosophy and Christian theology. Prisca Theologia and Philosophia Perennis. The Platonism ingrained in patristic apologetic lost much of its authority during the later Middle Ages, when Plato was largely eclipsed by Aristotle in the philosophical theology known as scholasticism. But it made a strong comeback during the Renaissance, for the simple reason that almost all the relevant original sources, Plato's complete dialogues, the Corpus Hermeticum, the Chaldean oracles, and a range of texts by Neoplatonic authors such as Plotinus, Iamblichus, or Proclus, now became available in Latin translation and could be diffused on an unprecedented scale thanks to the invention of printing. This Renaissance revival of Platonic Orientalism became known as Prisca Theologia, the ancient theology, or Philosophia Perennis, the perennial philosophy, two terms that have often been conflated but should be clearly distinguished. The program of Prisca Theologia, spearheaded by Marsilio Ficino, carried revolutionary implications of reform and renewal. The second half of the 15th century was a period rife with millennial and apocalyptic expectations, and the fact that all the ancient sources of religion and philosophy were now suddenly becoming available was not seen as mere coincidence. On the contrary, it had to be the hand of providence at work. God himself was telling the Christians how they could find their way back to the original fountains of divine revelation. Much of the excitement generated by the new Platonic philosophy has to do with this hopeful perspective of imminent renewal. There was, however, one peculiar aspect to Ficino's program. Although his Christian motivations were undoubtedly sincere, he was following in the footsteps of Gemistos Plethon by highlighting not Moses but Zoroaster as the earliest authority of ancient wisdom. This meant that even the religion of the Hebrews might ultimately be derived from, and hence dependent on, the teachings of a pagan sage, and even worse, one who was credited with having invented magic. Giovanni Pico della Mirandola's program of Christian Kabbalah looks like a deliberate attempt to correct that perspective and lead it back to a more orthodox direction. Like the patristic apologists, and unlike Ficino, Pico pointed to Moses as the earliest authority of ancient wisdom on whom all the pagan sages were dependent. But that was not all. Pico claimed to have made a sensational discovery that provided new and even more convincing arguments for the truth of the patristic point of view. At Mount Sinai, Moses had received not just the tablets of the law, intended for the multitude, but also a secret teaching reserved for the few, known as the Kabbalah. It was from this supreme wisdom that all the pagan sages had derived anything of enduring value in their teachings. The Kabbalah had been jealously preserved by the Jews and remained unknown to the Christians. But as the first Christian to study the Hebrew sources in their original language, Pico claimed he had discovered a secret to which the Jews themselves were blind. That all the essential Christian doctrines were already contained in the Kabbalistic scriptures, including even the name of Jesus. By making this argument, which, needless to say, finds absolutely no support in modern research of Jewish Kabbalah, Pico opened up the gates for the subsequent development of Christian Kabbalah as a specific form of Prisca Theologia. His program was even more revolutionary than Ficino's, for it implied not only a concordance between pagan wisdom and Christian doctrine, but would even force the Jews to accept the Messiah and convert to Christianity, an event that was widely expected to be the prelude for Christ's return. Of course, none of these high expectations were to be fulfilled. A few decades after the deaths of Pico and Ficino, a very different kind of reformation succeeded where theirs had failed. Martin Luther was calling for a return to the sources as well, but Protestantism would turn out to be more hostile to pagan wisdom than Catholicism had ever been. The notion of Philosophia Perennis, highlighted by Agostino Stucco in 1540, must be seen against this background. In contrast to the revolutionary implications of Prisca Theologia, Stucco's understanding of ancient wisdom was deeply conservative. Far from suggesting any need for return or reform, he simply stated that the universal and eternal truth had always been available to mankind and would always remain so. Stucco was on a first-name basis with the Pope, and his book appeared on the eve of the Council of Trent, where Roman Catholic theologians tried to find answers to Luther's Reformation. By emphasizing the universal concordance of all ancient wisdom with Roman Catholic doctrine, Stucco was making a final attempt to preserve the unity of the one church as the divinely instituted repository of everything that had ever been true in religion and philosophy. No reform was necessary or even possible, in his view, for the truth had never been lost. Roman Catholicism had preserved the ancient wisdom intact and inviolate, and kept offering it to all Christians for the salvation of their souls. Thus one sees that the revival of Platonic Orientalism could have either revolutionary or conservative implications in a Roman Catholic context. The anti-heretical position. If we remember that apologetic are inseparable from polemics, it will come as no surprise that these agendas of integrating good paganism into Christianity are the reverse mirror image of equally powerful agendas of exclusion. First of all, one would obviously be mistaken in assuming that Catholics were uniformly positive about pagan wisdom, no matter how hard Protestant polemicists tried to suggest such a thing. Even the patristic apologists accepted it only in so far as they thought it coincided with Christian doctrine and depended on Mosaic revelation. And other fathers of the Church were far more skeptical, preferring to emphasize rather than minimize the differences between Gentiles and Christians. Tertullian has already been mentioned as an example, and as far as cultic practices were concerned, no compromise could ever be possible with pagan idolatry, which was so clearly condemned by the first two commandments. Once Christianity became dominant after Constantine, the whole range of divinatory and related practices flourishing in the Roman Empire, such as the reading of signs and omens, visions, dreams, oracles, astrology, necromancy and the various mantic arts, were prohibited under the headings of magia and superstitio, and it was generally assumed that all of them were ultimately forms of idolatry involving contact with evil demons. This only began to change during the later Middle Ages, as we have seen, with the emergence of the concept of magia naturalis. The most potent legacy that the early Christian polemicists bequeathed to the later Roman Catholic tradition was their conceptualization of heresy. As has been convincingly argued by Karen L. King, in line with the mainstream of modern research, anti-heretical strategies were devised not in the face of a clear external enemy, but to deal with an internal crisis of differentiation. The polemicists needed to create sharp lines of differentiation because in practice the boundaries were not so neat. 9 Modern scholarship has come to recognize that early Christianity was indeed a highly diverse phenomenon, with doctrinal interpretations running along a wide spectrum from Gnostic to what we would now see as Orthodox. In their attempts to create doctrinal unity according to what they saw as the true faith, church fathers like Irenaeus, Hippolytus and Epiphanius created the idea that it was threatened by a kind of counterchurch of heretics, known as the Gnostics. This anti-Gnostic polemic is a classic example of establishing identity by means of creating an other, and it is remarkable how uncritically even modern scholars have accepted it, mostly because of a deeply ingrained Protestant bias, until far into the 20th century. 10. A particularly effective strategy of polemical discourse is the creation of historical genealogies, according to which all forms of heresy can be imagined as having sprung from a single origin. Irenaeus described Simon Magus, Acts 8:9-24, as the original arch-heretic and instrument of the devil, and this narrative was adopted during the 16th century by many anti-witchcraft authors and critics of heresy, beginning with Johann Weyer. From Simon, as though from a seed pod, there sprouted forth in long succession the monstrous Ophites, the shameless Gnostics, the impious Valentinians, Cardonians, Marcionists, Montanists, and many other heretics. 11 But Simon himself, in Weyer's imagination, was heir to an even older genealogy of pagan idolatry that had its origin in Noah's son Ham and his son Misraim, believed to be identical to Zoroaster, the inventor of magic. 12 Such alarmist genealogies of darkness became a staple of later anti-witchcraft literature, and show how paganism and Gnostic heresy could be conflated to a point of virtual identity in the context of a Platonic Orientalism in reverse. Instead of a narrative of divine wisdom originating with Moses, we now get narratives of demonic infiltration originating with Zoroaster, and in both cases Plato and later Platonists are seen as the main channels through which heresy reached Christianity. In reality, the relation between pagan Hellenistic influences and the religious perspectives associated with Gnosticism is extremely complicated, but, as noted above, the simplifications of Nemohistorical narrative tend to be much more effective than the careful reconstructions of historians. Simply because pagan idolatry and heresy were both wholly negative terms that stood for Christianity's radical other, they were bound to be perceived, in the polemical imagination, as ultimately one and the same phenomenon of demonic error and spiritual darkness. On the eve of the Reformation, then, two different perspectives on paganism, both pioneered by the Fathers of the Church, were present in the Roman Catholic tradition. An inclusive one that accepted ancient pagan wisdom as potentially participating in Christian truth, and an exclusive one that rejected any pagan influence as demonic infiltration leading to heresy. With this paradoxical situation, the stage was set for the second act in the drama, from which our concepts of Western esotericism have emerged. Protestantism. From its inception, the Renaissance revival of Platonic Orientalism in the wake of Plethon, Ficino and Pico della Mirandola provoked a strong anti-Platonic reaction. Already in 1458, reacting to Gemistos' Plethon, the Aristotelian George of Trebizond described Plato as the source of every imaginable depravity and the fountainhead of all heresies. The idea of a genealogy of darkness, leading from the pagan Orient through Platonism to Christian heresies, such as those of the Gnostics, was developed especially in anti-witchcraft literature. The anti-Platonic critique culminated by the end of the 16th century in a large work by Giovanni Battista Crispo, De Platon Caut Legendo, on the need to read Plato with caution, 1594, who highlighted Plato as the chief agent of corruption in the Church. A crucial point about Crispo's book was that he asked the question of how it was possible that the Church had allowed the dangerous virus of Platonic paganism to enter and spread. His answer was clear. It had all begun with the so-called apologetic fathers, who, through an excess of kindness, had naively accepted Plato's teachings to play a role in theology. The irony is that Crispo, a counter-Reformation theologian who moved in the highest circles of the Catholic hierarchy, does not seem to have realized that this argument was a perfect weapon for Protestants to use in their battle against the Church of Rome. Of course, Protestant polemicists were already arguing that the Church had badly gone astray between the Apostolic period and the present time. A classic example is the large multi-volume church history known as the Magdeburg Centuries, published between 1559 and 1574 by Matthias Flacius Illyricus and a team of collaborators. As has been elegantly formulated. In this Protestant delineation, the Church starts in the Apostolic age in perfect purity, and is perverted by a process of slow canker, till it has become changed into its opposite, and is now the Church not of Christ, but of Antichrist, an instrument not for saving men but for destroying them. 13. The Magdeburg centuries still saw the institution of the papacy as the main agent of corruption, but from the end of the 16th century, more and more authors began to argue that the Hellenization of Christianity, that is to say, the influence of pagan philosophy, particularly in the form of Platonism, was the true origin of evil. The patristic apologists, beginning with Justin Martyr, had made a fatal mistake by opening up a dialogue with paganism instead of rejecting it radically, and heresy had been the result. Obviously, the contemporary revival of Platonic Orientalism was seen as particularly dangerous from such a perspective. As everybody could see, it led to a positive appreciation of pagan teachers like the Persian Zoroaster and the Egyptian Hermes, along with pagan practices such as astrology and magic, as well as the abstruse Kabbalistic speculations of the Jews, the traditional enemies of Christ. None of this, Protestant hardliners were arguing, had anything to do with the gospel. That Catholic intellectuals could seriously defend such teachings showed more clearly than anything else how badly they had lost touch with what the Christian faith should be all about. Anti-apologeticism. In Germany during the second half of the 17th century, this line of argumentation led to a school of thought that has been referred to as anti-apologeticism. 14. This modern label emphasizes the ambition of its representatives to give a radical Protestant answer to the patristic apologetic tradition through which paganism had come to infect the Church. The story of anti-apologeticism is closely linked to the emergence of history of philosophy as an academic discipline, and can be traced to the work of Jacob Thomasius, 1622–84. As will be seen, Thomasius started a new line of argument that developed through several stages in the work of his successors. It finally resulted in a conceptual framework that was inherited on a large scale by Enlightenment thinkers and has had a decisive influence on how Western esotericism has been conceptualized as a separate field of research. Thomasius took the first step in this development by coming up with a novel way of distinguishing between biblical religion and pagan philosophy. In typical Protestant fashion, he claimed that the former had been revealed straight by God and carried absolute authority. Because the biblical revelation is absolutely true, it does not develop and therefore does not have a history. And because God's word is wholly superior to human reason, it cannot be subjected to philosophical analysis either. One must simply believe it. The philosophical systems of the pagans, in sharp contrast, rely upon the weak and fallible instrument of human reason, and they all share one central assumption: that the world is eternal, and therefore has not been created by God out of nothing. The doctrine of creatio ex nihilo is in fact not biblical. It was introduced by Theophilus of Antioch and Tatian in the 2nd century 15. But Thomasius did not know that. Against the sharp biblical distinction between God and the world, or creator and creation, paganism made the world eternal like God himself. All heretical beliefs came from that core error. The doctrine of emanation, souls or intelligences are not newly created by God out of nothing but pour forth from his eternal essence. Dualism, form and matter, or God and matter, are equally eternal: pantheism, the world is God, and materialism, God is the world. In their different ways, they all amounted to deification of the creation at the expense of its creator. Through the devil's machinations, these doctrines had infiltrated Christianity, particularly in the form of Platonism. Thomasius rejected any such continuation of pagan philosophy in the context of Christianity as a case of syncretism, and thus of heresy, whether it occurred in the Fathers and Roman Catholic doctrine or in the various forms of Gnosticism and other sectarian movements that had sprouted from the arch-heretic Simon Magus. It is important to understand that, following the logic of Thomasius' argument, the entire history of the Church prior to the Reformation had now become synonymous with the history of heresy. In fact, history as such was equivalent to the development of error. In contrast to the absolute truth of God's word in the Bible, which was beyond time and development by definition, Church history as a whole could be described as a continuous emergence of false doctrines followed by successive attempts at pious reconstitution. And this process had not even ended with the Reformation. In spite of Luther's revolution, the most serious attempt, so far, to lead Christianity back to the gospel, the pagan heresies of Platonism were now emerging as heterodox spiritualities even in Protestant contexts. These were the many spiritualist and theosophical sects that flourished during the 17th century. What they all had in common, Thomasius pointed out, was their extreme emphasis on personal religious experience at the expense of doctrinal belief. The common term for this phenomenon was enthusiasm, schwärmerei, and again it was based on the core error of the eternity of the world, in this case in the form of the Platonic doctrine of emanation and restitution, which claimed that the soul has its origin in an eternal, divine substance, the divine light world, and will return to it again. Emanationism implied that human beings could return to God by attaining direct experiential knowledge of their own divine essence, by means of ecstatic states of mind, and this was clearly equivalent to the quintessential Gnostic doctrine of auto-salvation and deification by means of a salvational gnosis. As an effective polemical strategy, Thomasius' argument was a stroke of genius. It created a razor-sharp distinction between true Christianity and its pagan or heretical other, and showed how the enormous variety of the latter, from the patristics to their Gnostic opponents, and from Roman Catholicism to every form of Protestant heterodoxy, had emanated from one single principle. This principle, the eternity of the world, seemed equally relevant on the levels of ontology and epistemology. It pertained to the general philosophical worldviews of the pagans and heretics, from dualism to pantheism, and everything in between, as well as to their opinions about how to find true knowledge, the primacy of gnosis based on the eternity of the soul. In short, Thomasius had found a way to kill not just two birds, but the whole family of heretical birds with one single stone. Thomasius' approach was picked up by a belligerent Lutheran minister, Ergot Daniel Kahlberg, 1659-98, who used it as the conceptual basis for a radical attack on heresy in 2 volumes. Das Platonische Hermetisches Christentum, Platonic Hermetic Christianity, 1690-1. For the first time in history, everything nowadays studied under the rubric of Western esotericism was presented here as belonging to one single family tree of heresy, on the basis of an analysis of what its adherents had believed and proclaimed. The core error was the attempt to apply philosophical reasoning to divine matters, which are simply beyond the scope of the weak human intellect. When human beings are so presumptuous as to fathom the nature of the revealed mysteries about which God's word keeps silent, 16 the result is syncretism. In Kahlberg's heresiological imagination, the many sects of Platonic Hermetic Christianity were like a filthy breed of vermin that had come crawling from the Platonic egg. Yet another example, like the seed pod of Simon Magus, see above, of how vivid images of horror can be combined with historical genealogies that dehumanize the enemy while tracing all forms of otherness back to one single demonic origin. By and large, Kahlberg saw heresies concerned with the nature of the soul as Platonic, and those concerned with the study of nature, especially alchemy and Paracelsianism, as Hermetic, but both were conceptually grounded in Thomasius' understanding of paganism as a unified tradition that rejected the doctrine of creation out of nothing. We will see anti-apologeticism return to the stage in the guise of Enlightenment historiography, in the third and final act of the historical drama from which our concepts of Western esotericism have emerged. But first we need to give some attention to the other side of the story. Just as the apologetic tradition in Roman Catholicism stood against a polemical rejection of anything pagan, Protestant polemics against paganism and heresy were accompanied by their apologetic counterpart, the Pietist reaction. As the Reformation split off from Roman Catholicism, its representatives began to quarrel among themselves about the correct interpretation of the Christian faith. The result was an increasing fragmentation of Protestantism into larger and smaller sects and spiritual communities, including many believers who were appalled by the dogmatic intolerance of orthodox hardliners and heresy hunters. They felt that true Christians should try to emulate the original apostolic community. Instead of fighting like cats and dogs over doctrinal matters, they should concentrate on cultivating an exemplary life of pious virtue in harmony with one another and the moral teachings of Jesus. Such circles were more receptive than their orthodox Protestant counterparts to Platonizing tendencies or alchemical and Paracelsian speculation, leading eventually to Christian theosophy and a fascination with Rosicrucian ideals. Precisely such tendencies were, of course, rejected as Platonic Hermetic Christianity by Kahlberg, and towards the end of the 17th century, similar accusations began to be leveled at the Pietists. But the latter had ideas all of their own about the true nature of faith and hence about the history of Christianity, and this led towards a perspective that would become extremely influential in the study of Western esotericism. The central figure here is the radical Pietist Gottfried Arnold, 1666 to 1714, the author of the famous Unparteiisch Unendiketzer History, Impartial History of Churches and Heretics, 1699 to 1700. Pietists like Balthasar Kopka or Johann Wilhelm Zerold, whose works are largely forgotten today, had reacted to anti-apologetic critics by somewhat ambiguous attempts at defending the patristic apologetic perspective. But very interestingly, Arnold found a way of using not apologeticism, but anti-apologeticism itself as a weapon to defend the heretics. He agreed with authors like Tertullian or Thomasius that there could be no concord of any kind between pagan philosophy and Christian faith, and thus he gave not the slightest attention to Platonism or other Gentile philosophies in his history of Christianity. But at the same time, he seems to have understood the vulnerable point in the arguments of the anti-apologists. As Protestant historians became ever more adept at recognizing traces of pagan philosophy in Christian doctrine, it was becoming evident how little of it was free from such influence, and how difficult, or rather, impossible, it was to do without it. It was simply not possible to build a theological system on the Bible alone. The profound irony is that in their obsession with pagan contamination, the anti-apologists therefore ended up undermining the very orthodoxy they were trying to defend, while giving food to the Pietist argument that the Bible was all about practical piety and not about theological doctrine at all. On that basis, Gottfried Arnold changed the rules of the game. He built his history of Christianity on the opposition, not between biblical Christianity and pagan heresy, but between true Christian piety and doctrinal theology. The question of pagan philosophies and their historical influence ceased to be of any relevance. The only valid criterion was whether an author's works exemplified the spirit of humble faith, love, unity, peace and practical piety that Arnold believed had been practiced by the original apostolic community. All who did so were true Christians, whether or not they might be seen as heretics by the official church. The true heretics were the dogmatic theologians with their endless disputes about doctrinal details. They were responsible for turning the Church of Christ into a filthy cesspool of quarreling, slandering, violence and vain ambition, another potent image of polemical otherness. Against the depressing spectacle of historical Christianity, with its endless doctrinal disputes, Arnold posited a superhistorical principle of immediate religious experience grounded in God's wisdom, Sophia. Such an experience of inner illumination, he insisted, is the work of God in the human soul, and its contents cannot be expressed in words. It is a hidden and secret mystery that reveals itself only in the intimacy of the humble and pious heart. Against the visible church with its endless doctrinal quarrels, bigotry, intolerance and violence, then, such divine illumination gives access to the invisible church, in which all true Christians are united. The former is an external phenomenon of history, the latter is an inner phenomenon of the spirit. If Thomasius and Kahlberg were pioneers in conceptualizing Western esotericism as a historical phenomenon grounded in the Hellenization of Christianity, Arnold is the chief pioneer of what we have identified 17 as the third model of Western esotericism, known as religionism and grounded in the concept of a universal, inner dimension of gnosis accessible through individual religious experience. As explained in Chapter 1, historical research concerned with such questions as how pagan philosophies have influenced the development of Christianity as a religion becomes meaningless in such a context. From a religionist perspective, such investigations make the mistake of reducing religion, or, in this case, esotericism, to a product of external historical factors, whereas its true reference is an independent spiritual reality sui generis. But from a historical perspective, religionism makes the mistake of ignoring religious diversity, historical change and any question of external influences because all it cares about is an experiential dimension that transcends history and will always remain inaccessible to scholarly research by definition. Modernity. We have now reached the third act of our drama of conflicts over identity. First, Roman Catholicism had established itself against Judaism and paganism. Then Protestantism positioned itself against Roman Catholicism, paganism and heresy. And finally, Enlightenment thinkers took up Protestant arguments, as we will see, in a direction that eventually led them to break loose from Christianity altogether. Of course, such a one-line summary of events that took place over 18 centuries can only be an extreme simplification, but it allows us to perceive at least the central pattern of how, and why, a specific domain of thought and practice has come to be excluded and widely perceived as other in the dominant narratives of Western discourse. The history of philosophy. German intellectual culture plays a central role in this third act. Christian Thomasius, 1655–1728, the much more famous son of Jacob Thomasius, used the critical tools of his father to liberate the history of philosophy from its theological dependencies and turn it into an autonomous discipline. Instead of rejecting the systems of pagan thinkers, one simply had to recognize them for what they were: attempts to understand the world by purely human means, without the aid of revelation. Christian Thomasius, traditionally seen as the father of the German Aufklärung Enlightenment, disliked syncretism as much as his father did. But he argued that one could purify philosophy from pagan prejudices and superstitions, so as to end up with a practical and useful philosophy free of metaphysics. The method for doing so became known as eclecticism. Instead of just describing the claims of the various philosophical schools, without distinguishing between true and false, the historian of philosophy should use his own faculties of rational judgment to separate the wheat from the chaff, accepting reasonable ideas wherever he found them while rejecting unreasonable ones. Eclecticism is a key factor in German intellectual life during the early and later Enlightenment. 18. Not only did it become the central tool of Enlightenment thinkers for distinguishing between reason and superstition, but even authors attracted to Platonic/Hermetic thinking were using it to highlight what they considered reasonable. For our present concerns, the radical Enlightenment wing is most relevant. Christoph August Humann, 1681–1764, dubbed the Thomasius of Göttingen, and often seen as the founder of history of philosophy as a modern discipline, wielded the eclectic method to get rid of pagan superstitions once and for all. In his journal Acta Philosophorum, in 1715, he presented a set of criteria for recognizing pseudo-philosophy, and made clear that he meant the entire lineage of ancient wisdom on Platonic Orientalist foundations. In his eyes it was nothing but foolishness, and so he was cheerfully laughing at its representatives while waving them goodbye forever. So adieu, dear Philosophia Chaldearum, Persarum, Egyptiorum, and see that one usually makes such a fuss about, out of blind veneration for antiquity. Abadi should hold it against me if I have not the slightest respect for all those Collegia Philosophica Secreta, but judge that the passing of time has quite rightly made a secret of these mysteries, by dumping them into the sea of oblivion, and that even if the writings of these Philosophorum Barbarorum were preserved by posterity, they would deserve to be sent ad locus secretia right away, for superstitious idiocies belong in no better library. 19. Humann was announcing the final disappearance of what we now call Western esotericism, from official philosophical discourse and from academic discussion generally. In the eyes of authors such as Jacob Thomasius or Aragot Daniel Kahlberg, these pagans and heretics had still been serious and dangerous opponents, but Humann dismissed them simply as fools and idiots who had no right to be taken seriously and whose writings deserved no place in scholarly or any other libraries. Academic research, after the 18th century, has essentially followed his advice. By far the most influential representative of Enlightenment eclecticism was Johann Jacob Brücker, 1696–1770, the author of a monumental 6-volume Historia Critica Philosophiae, Critical History of Philosophy, 1742–4, revised and expanded edition 1766–7. Brücker's name should be much better known than it is today. His work was the standard reference on history of philosophy from the Age of Enlightenment to at least the time of Hegel, and most of the entries on philosophical subjects in Diderot's famous Encyclopédie, as well as many other, less famous reference works, were paraphrased or plagiarized from the Historia Critica. Based upon the anti-apologetic principles of Jacob Thomasius and the eclectic method of Christian Thomasius and Christoph August Humann, Brücker presented a complete survey of the entire history of human thought, with the aim of separating the philosophical wheat from the pseudo-philosophical chaff. As a result, his magnum opus consisted of 2 interwoven strands: true philosophy, Philosophia Eclectica, and false philosophy, Philosophia Sectaria. We have seen that Kahlberg published the first history of Western esotericism in 1690–1. Brücker's discussion of Philosophia Sectaria must be recognized as the second one, and in fact, as perhaps the most extensive and detailed single survey ever published. Brücker distinguished between 3 general periods. 1. The Chaldean, Zoroastrian, Egyptian philosophies from before the birth of Christ. 2. The 2 great systems of Neoplatonism and Kabbalah during the Catholic era, and 3. The system of Theosophy that had emerged after the Reformation. The Historia Critica was obviously written from an extremely critical and hostile perspective on all these currents, for Brucker combined Hume's rationalism with a staunch profession of Protestant orthodoxy. But his work is marked by an acute sense of historical criticism, and rather than just dismissing sectarian philosophy out of hand, he rejected each and every thinker or system only after having studied them thoroughly and seriously, with an impressive command of the primary sources. In Brucker's synthesis, the domain that we would now refer to as Western esotericism is characterized as the continuation of pagan religion concealed as Christianity. With philosophy, it shares its pagan foundations, but it differs from philosophy in the fact that it is not based on reason. With Christianity, it shares its religious nature, but it differs from Christianity in that it is a false religion, not based on revelation. Brucker's work is of pivotal importance because it was written at a time when the memory of all these currents and ideas was still intact among intellectuals, while at the same time, it provided compelling reasons for dumping all of them into Hume's sea of oblivion. Historians after Brucker got the point. If all of this was no more than pseudo-philosophy and pseudo-Christianity, there was no longer any need to dignify it with much attention in the history of either philosophy or church history. From now on, these intellectual and religious currents began to vanish from academic textbooks, where they still have the status of mere footnotes today. No other discipline took them up, and as a result, they became academically homeless. During the 19th and much of the 20th century, scholars and intellectuals prided themselves on not knowing anything about such matters, so that deliberate ignorance about the traditions in question became deeply ingrained in academic life. With only very few exceptions, only amateur scholars kept writing about them, resulting in a hybrid literature full of historical errors and misconceptions. The doubtful quality of such writings further enhanced common perceptions of the occult as a domain below the dignity of serious intellectuals. This downward spiral was continued far into the 20th century, and only in recent decades does one see a serious effort on the part of scholars to educate themselves about this domain of rejected knowledge. If Protestantism established its identity against the pagan heresies that had crept into Roman Catholicism, the Enlightenment built further upon Protestant polemics to establish its own identity against superstition and prejudice. There is a popular assumption that the rational Enlightenment was attacking the irrationality of Christian belief and practice, but this is only half the truth. It is more correct to say that the true target was the paganism that had become ingrained in Christianity. One can see this clearly, for example, in a case like Voltaire's. In a well-known witticism, he wrote that superstition was born from religion, as the very foolish daughter of a wise and intelligent mother. Religion as such, reduced to the worship of a supreme being and the submission of the heart to his eternal orders, was therefore wise and reasonable enough for Voltaire. The problem was elsewhere. Born in paganism, adopted by Judaism, superstition infected the Christian church from the very beginning. And it was against that infection with occult prejudice that the Enlightenment was defining its own identity. Peter Gay's famous characteristic of the Enlightenment as the rise of modern paganism 21 is therefore spectacularly off the mark, but illustrates how thoroughly the modern academy has forgotten its own origins. The Romantic reaction. We are confronted with a similar case of nemo-historical amnesia in the case of German Romanticism and idealism. Their importance as cultural and philosophical phenomena is well known, but the general trend of eclectic historiography, see above, has resulted in selective pictures of what Romanticism was all about. Most relevant for our concerns is the impact of mesmerism and somnambulism during the first decades of the 19th century. The remarkable powers of vision and cognition that were displayed by somnambules in a state of trance, and widely discussed in contemporary society, were understood by Romantics in terms of a full-blown countermetaphysics directed against Enlightenment rationalism. The shallow daylight world of the rationalist, who reduces everything to cold logic and discursive prose, was placed in polemical contrast with the profoundly meaningful, nocturnal world of the somnambules, which expressed itself through symbols and poetic language. When the bodily senses shut down and we descend into dream or somnambulic trance, so the argument went, our soul wakes up to the larger spiritual world that is its true home. In other words, it is in fact the rationalist who is asleep and unconscious of the deeper levels of reality, and it is out of sheer ignorance that he dismisses the higher human faculties of supernormal cognition and occult power as superstition. Insisting that somnambulism revealed empirical facts about nature and the soul that were ignored by Enlightenment ideologues, Romantics were defending the scientific superiority of an enchanted worldview on Paracelsian and Christian theosophical foundations. And this perspective had far-reaching implications for the history of human thought. Romantics could now argue that all the marvelous phenomena consigned to the wastebasket of history by the Enlightenment, magic, divination, clairvoyance, symbolism, the occult, were in fact natural manifestations of the soul and its hidden powers, and central to the development of human culture. combining idealist narratives of how the spirit comes to self-realization through history with a pietist emphasis on interiority. Authors such as Joseph Ennemoser published large histories of magic, in which external events were only the reflections of deeper inner events of the soul and its mysterious powers. In such narratives, the ancient world was idealized as a golden age, in which humanity had still understood the mysterious language of nature, and the Orient was the original home of the ancient wisdom. We have seen that mesmerism and somnambulism developed in straight lines towards experimental psychology and psychiatry, as practiced in the decades around 1900. The psychology of Carl Gustav Jung was grounded in German Romantic mesmerism to a much larger extent than is usually appreciated, and he adopted an approach to history on Romantic and idealist foundations. According to Jung's account, which has exerted an enormous influence on popular notions of esotericism, after World War II, a continuous spiritual tradition could be traced from Gnosis and Neoplatonism in late antiquity, via medieval alchemy to Renaissance traditions such as Paracelsianism, and from there to German Romantic mesmerism and, finally, modern Jungian psychology. Jung formed the center of what has become a highly influential tradition of modern thought in which psychology is combined with a fascination for myth and symbolism, in deliberate reaction against the dominant trend of rationalization and disenchantment of the world. Intellectuals and scholars who sympathized with such an agenda met at annual conferences at Ascona in Switzerland, known as the Eranos meetings. 22 What they had in common was a conviction that man is not capable of living by reason alone, as naively assumed by Enlightenment and positivist thinkers. If the non-rational, savage, or primitive energies of the psyche are not allowed to express themselves and are suppressed into the unconscious, they will sooner or later break through the surface, with destructive results. This was held to be true not only for individuals, but for the collective as well, and hence catastrophes like World War I and II would be interpreted as examples of what happens if the non-rational is repressed by the official discourse instead of integrated in the general culture. After World War II, Eranos became the annual meeting place of an impressive series of high-level scholars and intellectuals, including the historian of Jewish Kabbalah Gershom Scholem, the scholar of Islamic mysticism Henry Corbin, and the religious comparativist Mircea Eliade. In different ways, they shared a deep concern with emphasizing the vital importance of myth, symbolism and gnosis, and in crucial respects their work is a continuation of German Romantic and idealist approaches combined in specific cases with elements of esoteric currents such as, notably, French Illuminism and traditionalism. Most important for us, Eranos became by far the most influential 20th-century representative of religionism, combining the widespread nostalgia for an enchanted worldview with strong emphasis on an inner spiritual dimension as a means of escape from, in Eliade's words, the terror of history. During the 1960s, this European intellectual tradition spread to the United States, and its main representatives attained an almost iconic status as modernist critics of the positivist mainstream. Jung, Eliade, Scholem and Corbin became famous in this period, along with American representatives of the same Eranos tradition, such as Joseph Campbell, James Hillman and many others. Eliade's so-called Chicago School even came to dominate the study of religion in the United States for several decades. Eranos scholarship appealed not just to a new generation of academics but to a very wide audience of readers, and many of the books by its main authors have become classics that remain easily available as paperbacks in general bookshops. The general approach and underlying assumptions of the Eranos school were adopted as a matter of course by most scholars who, since the 1960s and 1970s, began to get interested in Hermetic or occult traditions as objects of study. The most prominent example of all is Antoine Favre, who was closely associated with Eliade and Corbin and participated in several Eranos conferences in the first part of the 1970s. We have seen that his famous definition of Western esotericism is a prototypical example of the enchantment model, and we can now see that his understanding of Western esotericism comes out of the religionist stream mediated primarily by German Romanticism. Favre distanced himself from religionism during the 1990s, but his definition has exerted a very strong influence on the historically oriented scholarship that has emerged during the last 2 decades. Having traced a series of polemical and apologetic conflicts from antiquity to the present, we may conclude that the conflict between biblical Christianity and paganism dominated the first and second act of the drama, in the context of Roman Catholicism and Protestantism. The situation changed in modernity. The anti-pagan Protestant argument was transformed in Enlightenment contexts into a blanket dismissal of magic, the occult, or superstition, as a wastebasket of irrational nonsense below the dignity of serious scholarship, but a romantic reaction to this Enlightenment approach, grounded in German culture, developed during the 20th century into a highly influential religionist perspective that came to dominate popular perceptions of Western esotericism. Both approaches were based on ultimately anti-historical foundations. The former chose to ignore any historical currents and ideas that were not considered reasonable and scientific enough, whereas the latter claimed that esotericism was really about a suprahistorical, inner, or spiritual dimension, not about any external influences or developments. This is why neither of these approaches, nor the Nemohistorical narratives that are based upon them, will be followed in the rest of this book.